We're going to talk about adjective agreement. So first, it's important to define an adjective. An adjective is a word that describes a noun. If you remember, a noun is a person, place, or thing, so an adjective is essentially a descriptor word. So, for example, if I were to take the word tall, which I'll be using for most examples in this video, this would be an example of an adjective. Tall, intelligent, fast, things like that. Anything that can describe a noun. Now, one thing to note is the fact that adjectives actually work different in English. There's only one form of tall in English. However, there's four when we're talking about Spanish. So, let's lay out some sentences real quick. The boy is tall. The girl is tall. The boys are tall. And the girls are tall. So if we take a look at this, you can see that tall is going to stay the same in every single one of these sentences. However, the funny thing is, in Spanish, we'd actually use a different form of tall for each of these. Now, the form of tall that we'll be using is alto, alta, altos, and altas. But it depends on what exactly we are talking about. So, if we are talking about, let's say, something that was masculine and singular, such as the boy, it's a masculine thing, right? It's got a male gender, and it is a singular thing. Then we're going to use alto. Versus if we're talking about alta, that would be feminine singular. Altos, masculine plural. And finally, altas, going to be feminine plural. And so you can see that for tall, we actually have four different forms in Spanish, while in English, we only have one. So let's take a look at how we would translate these sentences. El chico es, and real quick, which of these forms are we going to use? Alto, right? Now the next one, la chica es, which one will we use? Alta, because you can see that tall is describing the girl, and since the girl is feminine and singular, we're going to have to use alta. And so one thing to note in Spanish is that these nouns are overall going to have a lot of influence on the things that go on around it. So, for example, if you've already seen my video talking about nouns and gender, or if you see my video talking about indefinite and definite articles, you can see that the noun holds a lot of weight on what's going on around it. Now next, we would say los chicos son, and then altos, because chicos is being described here, so we have to use the masculine plural version. And finally, las chicas son altas. And so you can see that they work a bit differently in Spanish than they do in English. We only have one form, but in Spanish it always has to match up with what exactly is being talked about. So in this case, I was talking about using it for people, but it also works the same for objects. So for example, if I want to say the table is hard, the way to say hard in Spanish is duro. However, in this case, we're going to say la mesa es, we have to say dura, because we're talking about the table, right? La mesa. In this case, it ends in a feminine ending, so it's going to have to be dura. And so we can see that these adjectives are essentially going to align with whatever is going to be talked about. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is known as gender-neutral adjectives. So if you remember, there are things known as gender-neutral nouns, but gender-neutral adjectives also exist. And so this basically means that it's an adjective that can be used for either masculine or feminine nouns without having to switch. So, for example, if we took the word inteligente, you can see that it ends in an E, and this is known as gender-neutral. So typically with gender-neutral adjectives, they're things that don't end in that O at its masculine singular form. So it'll be adjectives that end in stuff like E, or for example, if we were to look at my, which is also known as an adjective, me, this would be gender-neutral. And so overall with gender-neutral adjectives, you can actually use it for both. So if I were to say the girl is intelligent, the girl is smart, la chica es inteligente, and it's going to be the exact same for the boy. The boy is intelligent, so it's going to have to be el chico es inteligente. So you can see there's no difference in the form of inteligente that we're using because it's known as gender neutral. However, one thing that's very important to note is that it still matters on the number of what we're talking about. So, inteligentes exists as well. So if I were to say las chicas, and I want to say the girls are intelligent, I have to say las chicas son inteligentes, and you can see we're including this S at the end. The same goes for the boys are intelligent. Los chicos son inteligentes. And so overall, with these you can see that in general, there's always going to be at least 2 forms of every adjective in Spanish, and typically 4, as most adjectives are going to end in an O at its masculine singular form, and so it's going to be known as gendered. Now, one thing to note is that these are completely separate from verbs. Sometimes I see people getting mixed up with the o, asa, almost, is, on. Remember, that's just the action, and we're talking about who's doing the action in that. In this case, these are describing nouns, and so we have to change it based on the noun. So it's a completely different relationship going on here. So please try your best not to confuse those two. But overall, adjective agreement, it can be a little tough for English speakers because we don't have it. We only have one form of every adjective. But if you kind of understand that overall in Spanish, nouns hold a lot of weight and influence the things that are going around it, adjective agreement can be learned pretty quick.